Welcome to Red Star Over Asia, everyone. For this episode, we go to the far western edges of Asia, the Republic of Georgia. It's a land between Eastern Europe and Central Asia, in some ways a nexus between those geopolitical spaces. So on this show, we tend to focus on East Asian topics, but we had the opportunity to have a good friend of the show and a good personal friend of a couple of us, Sopo Japardize. She's a labor organizer based in Tbilisi, Georgia. And most listeners will probably know Georgia as the former USSR Soviet Republic. Sophia and her comrades actually host a great podcast focused on this legacy called Reimagining Soviet Georgia. And we have links for that in the show notes. So please check out their show. It's fantastic. It's a really well-curated show. In this two-part episode, we talk about the legacy of Soviet Georgia, as they cover much more extensively in their podcast. But we also talk about the country's experience having been the laboratory for some of the most darkest fantasies of U.S. libertarian think tanks in the aftermath of the socialist bloc collapse in the early 90s. We also discuss contemporary social movements in the country and the New Left's efforts to forge an independent path between NATO expansionism from the West and the cynical transgressions of Russia's oligarchy, on the other hand, from the East. And we also have links to Sophia's written work in the show notes, so definitely check that out. You're in for a fascinating conversation about a really interesting country that we don't discuss enough. So we think you're really going to enjoy this episode. We have a very special guest today joining us from the far western edge of Asia in Tbilisi, Georgia. Sopo Japardize. How are you doing?
You need to pronounce my name more correctly. Japardize. Mike, you got to do this. Or just say Sopo. Fuck it. Just say Sopo or Sophia. That's it. Otherwise, it just sounds crazy.
I want to get this right.
We're like good friends, and you can't say it right.
This was not your name when we were in the U.S.
I understand that. Because I get it. Just say Sophia. You don't have to say my last name. Just say Sophia.
I'm committed to getting it right now.
Naiarevi darsulis, nangrevi nari qalasi, jagarasavit shemugchenia. Tbilisa, zitavarde vismhareo, ushenot, sitot khletar milda. Sadaris, slagana khalibarazi, Sadaris, shaharam tatmida.
All right, welcome everyone to Red Star Over Asia. We have a very special episode today. We have a good friend and comrade, Sopo Japardize from Tbilisi, Georgia. She is a labor organizer, activist, and socialist. She also writes for Jacobin magazine and some other publications. So we want to welcome her to the show. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing well. I'm happy to be here with all of you.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. We also have our co-hosts, Bori, up in Seoul. How are you, Bori?
Great. Lovely weather, Jay.
All right, very good. And then we have Jay from Gwangju, but currently exiled in Indiana. How you doing over in the American Empire?
Humid.
Yeah, it's getting a little humid over here in Busan as well. All right, so today, typically our shows have focused on East Asia. We are primarily based out of South Korea, but today we are going to the far western edges of Asia to talk about Georgia, the Republic of Georgia. So Georgia is, most people know it as a former Soviet republic. It's not often in the news that much, but it's a very fascinating place with some very interesting social movements going on. And it is an important contested space geopolitically in the world and has been a laboratory for various experiments in neoliberalism. So this is a subject we've all been interested in learning about, and we hope you are too. So we have our friend Sophia, who's on the show today to help us talk about this, she's again an activist and organizer based in Tbilisi. She also works regionally with workers in that part of the world. So, Sophia, can you tell us a little bit about your background? So, you're based in Tbilisi. You're doing some worker organizer stuff, but you grew up in the U.S. for a big part of your life, which is how we met. So, can you talk a little bit about how you ended up back in Georgia and the kind of work that you're involved with there?
Yeah, so I left when the Soviet Union was destroyed. In 1992, we moved to New York, and I lived in the U.S. for 22 years. And then 6 years ago, I moved back to my country, Georgia, even though, I left the sort of USSR and I came back to a totally different country. And that's been kind of a culture shock as well, because it did change. And you should know that, because countries people assume it's the same thing, but it's really not. People have changed, things have changed, and architecture, everything has changed. And so in reality, I think I had severe nostalgia for the Soviet Union. I just thought it was Georgia, but it's really, I didn't want to just go back to Georgia. I think I wanted to go back to the Soviet Georgia, which doesn't exist anymore. So I came very with romantic ideas, I think, about Georgia, very romantic ideas, and was slightly, I think, silly in a way. I'm almost embarrassed at the naivete that I had coming back, and to sort of work here and do nonstop sort of organized, do political work for 6 years have made me a worse person, I have to say, but also much more, I think awake about a lot of things that I had not really seen before. I think in a way I had to understand the world better, and especially understand all the theories that we've been learning, all my socialist sort of, I don't know, upbringing and so on. A lot of assumptions have been tested here, and I had to see totally a different part of not just the world, but in political consciousness for me to understand so many things now. I feel I'm a better revolutionary because of it.
You touched on the fact that you were born in Georgia when it was still part of the USSR. You left when you were quite young and moved to the US. So when you returned, what were the things that really struck you as having changed dramatically? I mean, because obviously, of course, Georgia has changed dramatically, but specifically, what were some of the things that really surprised you?
Yeah, I think starting from my family. So I left, my family was very close growing up, very close. We had a huge extended family. We used to stay at people's houses, 1 month at this house, 1 month at that house. And nobody was really speaking to each other. The extended family was completely broken. I was shocked by that because, again, totally different upbringing I had to the new generation of my family members, very different upbringing. And again, some of it might also be my childhood, because a lot of people, when you have memories, it's a lot more rosy when you're a child. So it could be also that, but there is just people are really mean. I think in the US where everybody's sort of forced to be sterile nice all the time, smile at you and stuff. And everyone's really mean here. Nobody's forced to customer service non-existent. So I think I had a really hard time at seeing how sort of aggressive and self-centered people were in public spaces. That was really hard for me to comprehend. And a lot of things the moral value systems in some ways, when we have in the US, it's very it's still a bit there's the good guys and the bad guys, and then you do something and people appreciate it. There's a sense of recognition of things in the US. Say if somebody does something well or whatever, that almost doesn't exist here. It's very competitive. It's it's in a strange competitive place where everyone's always watching what you have, and it's a very, I don't know what it is exactly, but it's maybe it's a small place. It's a small town mentality more, where everybody knows your business, everybody's watching, judging, how do you have this, how do you not have this. So it could be a lot of things that have nothing to do with politics, say. But I think in general, I do think there was a sense of, after the Soviet Union collapsed, it was sort of every man for himself. survival became very difficult. Even though in the early 90s, when everything collapsed, there was no lights, there was no, I didn't live in that time, but I think it had a profound impact of that kind of humanitarian collapse of over 10 years that way. And then it's really 30 years continuing on, where, over 1 million people have migrated, people, broken homes, children are being raised without parents. So I think there's like so many things that I can be like easily say, oh, look, everyone's mean, or like, I'm like, whatever. I wanted friendlier, sweeter people because I had like romanticized my own nation and thought that we were all great. And then all of a sudden they're not. And so like, I'm like, not gonna be like, oh, so, fuck you guys. Like, you guys suck. Like, it's not like that, but it's like, it can't come off like that, but it's really like, there's all these things have happened that have led to people behaving and being traumatized, I think, by poverty, by, collapse and so on. But this is also why it led me to do the Reimagining Soviet Georgia project, because I realized that these are like profound changes. Like I can't say, like, I think a lot of people who wanted the Soviet Union to collapse, or they didn't think it was real socialism or whatever, our Trotskyist tradition of constantly criticizing. What happened though for it to collapse that dramatically was a shock for millions of people that have not recovered from. So I do think it's like a humanitarian crisis, what happened, in the early 90s and on. It led to a lot of deaths, led to a lot of drinking, abuse, like just brokenness, as like, entire nations were sort of I don't want to say nations of people were really just traumatized by it. So I think that shows in the everyday here.
You just mentioned the collapse of the USSR. Like, what in your estimation were some of the primary causes of that? Because Georgian nationalism played a role in some ways. I mean, there was a referendum across the USSR on a new union treaty that would have dramatically reformed the USSR, but would have kept it together. Georgia was one of the few republics that rejected it. So what do you think people in Georgia were thinking in the lead up to the dissolution of the Soviet Union? And like, what were their aspirations? What were their motivations? Like, what do you think were like some of like the important causes that led to the dissolution?
Yeah, so I have a rare position where I think it mostly has to do with the Western propaganda and Western interference that led to the demise of the Soviet Union. I think people are always like, oh, the economic side was unsustainable, the nations wanted freedom. Like, no, I'm like pretty, again, I'm not like 100% sure because I'm still like investigating, thinking things through. But like reading like some of the Radio Freedom, Radio Liberty, if you know what that is, was like these radios like that were based in Germany, like broadcasting sort of freedom, whatever segments. They were just all nationalism. If you read those files, like I read their like manuals, it was like makes Georgians feel like they're a colony without saying the word colony. These are just things that they're saying to their broadcaster, like they're like whatever. People that tell whatever, like people that like record the videos or whatever. And so I like seeing the ways that it was attacked, which was nationalism, right? That was one of the things that they did was like continuously attack the Soviet Union for, Georgian like sort of they counterposed Georgian nationalism to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was, an international Soviet project that was actually kind of interesting because they attempted to erase nationalities and create a Soviet man, and so that was one of the ways to, what are ways that you can sort of destabilize like communism, right? Which is like, you go for the national stuff. You attack it on the religious front, right? You do that whole like, civil rights, right? And civil and political rights. And those were the ways that they were being attacked all the time. And I think like, sure, if, it was like, I think the political ruling class of the Soviet Union was really, like they had no politics since like, I would say after Khrushchev, they had like almost no politics. They were just sort of running on empty, but they were still like, doing things in a very mechanical way. And I don't think like that is that's what leads to collapse, because there's so many terrible and shitty governments that exist today with tons of contradictions that have not collapsed. So you can't say like just because there are internal contradictions and it must collapse, right? Because the U.S. has insane amount of internal contradictions, yet it goes on and on and on. You can look at Iran or whatever it is, and they still exist. So there must be something else besides internal contradictions of the economic factor, the cultural factor, or whatever. So I would say that I think there's a lot of combinations of things of why it led to its demise. But I think like they didn't have they didn't have any politics like the ruling class. And I think they looked at the West and they thought we can get really rich. Like we're just like, we have like one dacha here, or two dachas, like vacation homes, and it's like we don't have that much stuff. And so they were like, we can get so much more, Like I do think the ruling class sold us out, and they did. They became billionaires, right? Like all of them. And they have for them, for the 1%, demise of Soviet Union has led them to like insane wealth and freedom, while for almost everyone else, it has led to the less freedom and less capacity to exist in the world, right? Either way, it's economic development or social or whatever.
Taking on that nationalist question, I was curious on what kind of forms does it take? Is there any merit to a Georgian nationalism? Could you speak more to that? Like, I think nationalisms around the world have its own founding myths, and at a basic level, it's going to be all rejected, but they have their own specific arguments. And I think when I heard about in the case of Belarus, it seemed much more complicated in that it explicitly needed to found a myth for its nationalism. There wasn't a past it could cohere to, to found something to return to, if that makes sense.
Let me just go back to like what happened. Where's nationalism coming from? So, the Social Democrats, sort of the Mensheviks, but the Georgian Mensheviks were sort of way cooler than the Russian Mensheviks. Let's just say that, even though they still are Mensheviks. Georgia had a Menshevik government for like 3 years in 1918 to 1921. And they were really anti-nationalist, even though actually it started off with like, I think the leader of that movement actually had a really good line. And they were like, they were constantly fighting with the nationalists. And they actually came to be the Social Democratic Party, sort of formed by being anti-nationalist. Because it's a true Marxist sense, right? They were for like, liberation from colonialism and things like that, but not nationalists. So they had a much different vision of Georgia based on territory. Like, so if you're in this territory, you have these rights. Because there's different kinds of ways to understand who are the people, right? Who is a Georgian? And that has changed many times. Who is a Georgian? Because there's also this talk of like, because there's some Muslim Georgians. Are they Georgian? And so there's like this like very famous thing that people say here, which is like land or like country, like language and religion. That's what the nation is. And that's how they frame it. This is like one of the most like nationalist people that were defeated by the Social Democrats who've come back. They've brought him back to life, and this like understanding of who we are. And so that has changed. And so Georgia has not existed as Georgia for forever. Like this is like the first time really, right? And so before it was like there's different provinces in Georgia, and sometimes some part of it would be part of the Ottoman Empire, some of it would be part of Russia, and so on. It's changed constantly. So that's one thing we can say, is that the Georgian identity is continuously being reforged and forged again of what that means to be Georgian. So, and that's why I'm pointing this out, because I think people have this like here especially, they think like this stuff is just like God just like came and like was like, you're Georgian, and like just gave you this land and said that, and this is how people explain it. So what happened is during the Soviet Union, while there was an attempt to remake and like have like a Soviet person, there's also a lot of money and support for sort of cultural Georgianness and everywhere that was being spent on. So they were encouraging Georgian dances, Georgian art, Georgian folklore, whatever. And so some liberals will say now that USSR is responsible for the nationalism today because they helped create it, because they funded the ethnic sort of cadre of like this like elites that all of their work was to reproduce and reproduce the Georgian identity through cultural work. We think of it as like de facto good to like, because we think of it like, I at least think of US, right? Like, everybody's like always fighting for their identity politics. Like I would like, I'm Chicano or I'm this or I'm that. And I should have like, this is my culture and I eat this way, I dress this way. It's like such a big part, but most of that is like made up, right? Like it's constantly like, what is authenticity, right? Authenticity is this like, this is authentic, whatever, Guatemalan or authentic Georgian, or there is no such a thing as an authentic anything. It is constantly being created. So this obsession with sort of essentializing in a way identities, right, has become a problem everywhere. And that's how a lot of the problems emerged in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was trying to, this idea that you should support these small ethnicities and not like trample them, right? So you shouldn't be like how it was before where you forced them, like during the Russian Empire, there's attempts to crush the Georgian language, crush the Georgian culture, and so on. Though there are times where it was like you could see like when Stalin died, it led to a lot of like problems with Georgia being like getting more, like they had so many privileges before, so they had less privileges then, and so on. But there's like you can go, there's like a lot of nuances here. But the Soviet Union created Georgia, I think, in some ways, right? So this nationalist idea of like, we have these like, everybody thinks every dance we have, every food we have is thousands of years old, but it's just not. Some of them was like revitalized and made as like some kind of very authentic, ancient traditions. So when you have that, and then you have all this outside pressure, and, actually you will see my partner in Reimagining Soviet Georgia, Brian Gigantino is working on trying to like sort of trace in the US, like all these like nationalist, anti-Soviet sort of groups that were formed by the government and how they were trying to sort of destabilize the Soviet Union by supporting these small ethnic nationalities and stuff. So there was like a lot of pressure. And then you had, so there was like internally you were constantly funding culture, but of course, as like every employer knows and every, government, once you start yielding stuff, then people's appetites, right, standards go up. So they want more and more. So like before when it's like sort of like, there's like an asshole that's like always mean to you, but like one time he's nice. So you're like, oh my God, he's the nicest person. But then somebody's like always nice. You just have this expectation that they're going to be nicer and nicer, So there's like a lot of this, like, I would say like mentality of like when you yield so much and you have so much freedom in a way around your culture that you think that's normal and you don't realize how in other places that's like not how it is. And you're actually denied that. So you sort of take it for granted and you demand more. So I do think a lot of the Soviet Georgia stuff was a little bit like they sort of didn't realize, and I think in Soviet Union, I don't think they realized how much stuff they had. Like, so all the stuff about like all the houses, like free housing, free healthcare, free education, sanatoriums to rest, like affordable whatever food and so on. And there's like so much stuff they had, and all this like culture, as and you can go to theater was thriving, all these poets were thriving, despite that there's also censorship and them even like fighting the censorship, still thriving because there was this illegal books and illegal like material that people were still consuming, right? So in a way it's still available. And so when you have all this, they thought that they're going to get even more by joining with the West. It's like, no, like if you join the West, you can get like Nike shoes, but you will not get healthcare anymore. Like there is like a huge trade-off. Like it's not just like this, it's hard for people to comprehend, but you have to understand the Soviet person. In 70 years, they've had a very total different experience, right? They have been sort of coddled. Like things that I am trying to explain to my aunt, she's like 83, and it's like, I'm like, you have never had a problem with finding a place to live or paying rent because you've always had free housing for 83 years. Like for her, she will never understand what I go through. You know, like it's so different in their world. Like they've just had these things and their expectation as well of people like taking care of you. You know, like family expectation as well. Like so, I think in some ways the government sort of being this huge welfare state, sort of taking care of all the people, also made people act towards each other like that. So there's like a lot of like caring, and you know, people like you can come and stay with your aunt or your friend for like 3 years for free or whatever. Like these things that looked upon in the US, like that would be crazy, right? You would not do that because there's a culture there from the state. No matter if it's like, of course there were problems and people are always talking about problems, but like, what was life like for an ordinary Soviet citizen? Like you should look at it that way. And it does vary across different countries, you know, like different parts. But what was it like? For most people, life was much better, like substantially better. And of course, people are like, oh, well, it's after Stalin. Of course, because Stalin during World War II, there was like, you know, this is when the industrialization is really happening, and the, you know, certain layer of being exterminated to make way for a different kind of Soviet Union and so on. So, like, of course, everybody was struggling after World War II. In England, they were like eating rats and, you know, had fleas and stuff as well. Like everybody was struggling. It's like people forget. It's like they take the Soviet Union like outside of context. Like, oh, everybody was doing great except for them. It's like, no, everybody was doing badly, you know? And so, and you have to see like a country that had 99.9% peasants who couldn't read turn into huge industrial powerhouse was like something that's kind of insane, which I'm sure in Korea, there's like, you guys probably have that rhetoric all the time because you're like, huge industrialization, how you sort of were able to overcome and shine or whatever.
The Han River miracle, baby. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because now, Georgians, like the nationalists and like anti-Soviet, will be like, oh, there was nothing. Russia, it's not Soviet anymore, right? All of a sudden, was stealing from us. Like we were like, this is the funniest thing I've ever heard. Everyone says this. Like, we gave so much to the Soviet Union and we were like oppressed. I'm like, you didn't do anything for the Soviet Union. You were giving like 15% input, 85% output. Like you were pretty much like living off of the Soviet Union, like a parasite mostly, you know, like you look at the numbers, it's not in Georgia's favor, you know? Sure, you could say you gave a lot in culture and this, but they also gave you a lot of like, we're about to interview this guy, Eric Scott, who talks about how Georgians pretty much ran the Soviet Union. Like they like had like all these high positions, and so if you understand nationalism only in your territory and you don't think about all your people going in and running shit around the world, then of course you're going to be very provincial about it, right? You're like, oh, I want my land right here. But if you think about it, Georgia had access to this huge, like, you know, fourth of the world, like Soviet Union, that they had really important positions in. And of course it did change after Stalin, because there was like much more, and we were sort of forced back to our territory after that for a little bit until Shevardnadze. But like for a small country with like 4 million people, and back then it was even less people, to have so much influence and you think that they're oppressing you is like, it's sort of provincial. I don't know how else to say it, but it's like you gotta have a better mind. You're not very smart. Like that's a huge thing that you have. As far as if you want to talk about nationalism, just in the pure sense, right, of Georgians being in control of something, not like, not in the sense like what were they doing and what was the nature of Soviet Union, were they doing good things or bad things? I mean, that's something different, right? The moral categories or ethical and political context. But as far as nationalism, what would you prefer? Have your own small state where you barely can control it, you have no economy, you have nothing, collapse? Or would you rather have more of a thriving state Sure, there are some limitations, but you're also running a fourth of the world. Like, decide.
What do people in Georgia like think of Stalin now? Like, what is the public memory of Joseph Stalin?
The anti-Soviets, of course, hate him. There's still just like 100-year anniversary of like Russian occupation, and if people who can't hear, I did what's it called, like air quotes, because I don't think it was like Russian occupation, and that's why. So, and there's this woman who like ran around and like poured like remaining like Stalin statues, like poured like paint on them. It's like, oh, I'm so cool. Yeah, I'm so cool. I'm fighting somebody from like 100 years ago, and yeah, I have a collapsing state. Yeah, like this is like one of the craziest things ever. Is like all they spend time on is trying to trash the Soviet Union, and they say nothing about contemporary Georgia of 30 years. Like this is crazy to me, right? And so Stalin, though most Georgians really love Stalin. First of all, even if you don't like Stalin, no Georgian as a nationalist has ever risen that high, ever. Not just Georgian, no one has, right? Stalin is sort of like the OG of the world, like leaders ever, right? So it's like even if you don't like him as a nationalist, you can just say, oh, well, at least he was a Georgian, right? Still a Georgian who ran the world, right? Who was like everyone terrified of. So by that standard, a lot of people like him. Not because he did great things. There's like the small communist party type communists who were like, we like Stalin because of A, B, and C. But then most people are just like nationalist about it. Or then there's the people who just hate him. And somehow there's like this liberal wing. I just hate fucking liberals here. It's like, oh, they're worse than American liberals. They're like obsessed. This is actually when the Asian stuff and European stuff comes in, right? The identity is like this sort of small elites who are obsessed with being European, and then thinking that Europe is some civilized, wonderful human rights place. They're always so sorry about Stalin, like so sorry about our Soviet totalitarian past of gulags, like they feel almost like guilty, and they feel embarrassed for being part of the Soviet Union, this uncivilized thing, being part of that at all. So it's a very frustrating dynamic, and I think those people are the ones who are like pouring like paint and stuff all over. Those, of course, and that's one thing I've really learned is like I've never met people who are anti-Soviet and actually for human rights, so it's like it's always just like a scam. They're just like conservatives, they're politically like they're like pro US like empire.
Yeah, I saw one time, and there was some expats in Georgia Facebook group or something, and like some Americans living in Georgia, I guess working for some NGOs or some company, were attacking you and being like, she doesn't understand that things were so bad in the Soviet Union. It's like, you're from California. Why are you even commenting on this?
So your podcast, Reimagining Soviet Georgia, is an effort to reclaim the legacy of the Soviet period. Can you tell us about that project, what motivated you, its goals, etc.?
Yes. So after doing like, at the time, like 5 years of political work in Georgia, so I started when I first got here, I met up with some students who were like, I would say, eclectic in their politics. Also, like, it's like the American, I don't know what it's like in Korea, but the American left is much more like they read a lot, and that's like making fun of us was that we had study groups too much. I would say the Georgian left doesn't read at all. Like, it's not like that. It's like, it's all the problems that we're like, oh, it's like we have no normal friends because all we do is talk about politics, and it was like really awkward, and then we'd like didn't know how to interact with like people who would want to talk about something else. Like we had all these problems in the US. Here it was like I was like shocked at how much no one talked about politics. It was just like regular stuff, but there was like a political like gathering or group, but they didn't discuss politics very much. Okay, so I was already like kind of like, okay, this is like strange for me because it's not what I'm used to. Also, like The discipline stuff is like a little bit more, like it's not like the U.S. The U.S. is like you're late one time, you get fired, you lose your home, you die. Like it's like the stakes are so high in the U.S.
Yeah.
Like everyone's like much more disciplined, not because they like want to, it's because they will die, right? Otherwise. So it's a much different world. And so in that discipline sort of carries over in other things as well, even though I would say the left in America is also not very disciplined. In Georgia, it's like a lot more relaxed. Everyone's a lot more, they're not militant like Americans are, In some ways it's good because fascism never really takes off here either, Everyone's like, nah, let's just go drink and hang out. Like, so it's like, in a way...
Joining an SS brigade.
Yeah, like, so I would say, like, it's positive and also negative, right? It's also very individualistic. And I think I've been trying to figure out why people cannot collectively work together, like why unions are so hard to form and keep going and so on, how there's almost zero cooperation. And I have some theories about that. And so I think one of them is this tradition of dissidence in the Soviet Union, which is one person, usually. A dissident who had like hated USSR, Freudian slip. So hated the USSR because they were Christian, and then one hated them because they were nationalists, and one hated them because of whatever reason. So it's like everybody had their own reasons, and like you didn't have to actually work with anyone because the entire thing was like one person goes out, makes connection with the West, reports on the atrocities of the Soviet Union. So that kind of legacy has nothing to do with us working together. And there's a great New York Times, Washington Post has an article about like Russia's dissidents, how none of them can get along after the breakup of Soviet Union, and like they're all like miserable and they just hate the people afterwards. Because first they were hating like Soviet Union, and then they just like turned on the people and hate each other. So that's exactly it. That's sort of the legacy. And so after doing all this work, and I came much more anti-Soviet to Georgia. I didn't even have that like a lot of these American or Western tourists like love like Soviet stuff, taking pictures at the old bus stop and here's Stalin statue. It's like ironic or whatever they do. I didn't even have that kind of stuff. I was just like, that's just, I'm not, because I'm not like a superficial, hipster. So I talked to a lot of workers because I was a part of strikes and I was going around, and they're the ones who like really made me reimagine the Soviet Union. Because for some reason, again, I blame this on my Trotskyist upbringing. I had assumed that the workers were like being beaten by like, leather belts or something all the time, being like, work, like a sort of sweatshop and no political rights. Like you had the image I had. And to find out that the workers were like super privileged, really well taken care of. Like, and then it's funny because if you think back what the charge against Soviet Union is, the workers didn't really work that much, right? It was inefficient. So if you think about that, and you're like, oh, okay, because they weren't capitalist efficient, right? They weren't like dying in a sweatshop for like 15 hours. They actually had you couldn't go into the mine for more than 7 hours because that's bad for your health. They had a whole institute dedicated to occupational health and safety and illnesses and tracking what illnesses were being, from what mine or from what profession. So much care about workers. They had extra milk and like whatever, like products, like food wise, because going in the mine was actually much more like harder work. So you had to be even more well taken care of and well fed. So if you start to think in those terms of like just worker rights, is huge. It's like it's incredible. It's a game changer. If you realize that workers were just so much better off. If you compare to now, it's horrid, right? If you think about it. And so like when you actually talk to workers themselves, they'll be like, "This is horrible what we're going through now. This is like slavery." People will say, people will say the term slave all the time. Yeah, I'm a slave, and we're not like workers anymore. Like the Soviet Union. So talking to them changed my opinion on the Soviet Union, and also just made me realize I just didn't know that much. I didn't know enough. I knew it sucks because I think we know very little, and we have these like talking points, and it's like, here's the Bolsheviks, here's their position 1917, and here's this other position, and this happened, and then like very sweeping statements about things. And it's like, oh, Stalin wanted, socialism in one country, and Trotsky was for permanent revolution and blah blah whatever. And then once you see that like that's not really doing a great job explaining the lived experience of Soviet Union, nor is just like being a fan of everything, nor is hating everything. You just sort of have to start really thinking about it. What was like, what did it achieve? Like, where was communism? Like, there were times where, like there's like this woman Keti Chukra that we interviewed recently. She wrote a book, Practicing the Good, Desire and Boredom in the Soviet Union. And her whole thing is like she's looking for places where there was communism, so where there actually was an attempt, and not where it was not, right? So not the failures, but where were the moments. But she's also looking at it like just some people just weren't ready for that much good. I thought that was really interesting. It's like, and I don't want to like butcher her thesis and stuff. Her interview will be out, so you guys listen to it. It's very interesting. But in a way, like commodity production, the things that people say are bad things about the Soviet Union, like there was like not enough whatever clothing or shoes or whatever it is, right? She says like it's like actually a good thing because this capitalism makes us feel lack all the time, right? So you're like too ugly, too fat, too skinny, whatever. You don't have the nice car yet. You don't have the whatever house. It's constantly creating a lack. So then you have to fill it, right? By buying more things. It's all about consumption. That's how the entire capitalist, like American, especially American capitalism, rests on consumption. And so it's like she calls it libidinal economy or whatever. So it's like constant desire of I need this, I need that. And so that was kind of like crushed, right? That wasn't there. So people had time, in a way, freed up people to think about other things besides fucking consuming all the time. And I've seen this with my American friends. Like I also first came here, even though I'm always pretty much poor and can't afford that many things, but I still have this like shop for things, just buy something. It's like literally just like to pay for something. It's like like that happens, you're just like, oh, I feel better.
Yeah, it's cathartic. Yeah, it's
like such an American mindset of just consumption, right? It's also just like Europe. Europeans a little bit more. It's a little bit more regulated, so not so crazy because they sell some free stuff, whatever. But having that being your like such an everyday part of your life, and I've seen my American friends visit, and I've seen them do the same thing. Like after living here and not shopping every day or every week, or not shopping, I mean like literally just buying something, right? Just constantly have to buy something. I was like, oh my God, this is like so great to live like this. Like you don't have to work. Like I barely buy anything now or whatever. And so like, or like it's much rare, And so like you freed from it. Like, oh, so nice. Because it's still existing now because they just don't have enough. They don't have enough money. People don't have buying power now. It's different. But to live in a world where you're not, like if you're not told that you're not pretty enough, like you're not going to buy the makeup, you're not going to need to have that. You're not going to feel a deficit. You're going to spend that time in something else, like a relationship with your family, with your friends, visiting, traveling, or whatever. When they say the millennials love experiences or whatever, like that's what it was. The Soviet Union was all about experiences, right? Traveling, like talking with your friends, drinking, hanging out, whatever. Going to the opera, everything was like free and available. And so I think like this, so finding things like that, so when we assume things like, oh, bread lines, oh, this, which were, much rarer, but like, what I mean? Like this idea of like what was lacking and bad about the Soviet Union is actually positive. And of course we know this in the West, right? People who grew up there, it's like all the rich people are always trying to do the experiences stuff. All the rich people are all about slow food and all the stuff the Soviet Union had. Now it's like popular by this aristocratic like culture. But they told us we were poor and losers. We didn't have that.
Right. Yeah. When I visited a couple years ago, I visited Uzbekistan and with a friend of mine who's from Uzbekistan. And, obviously I was interested in what the opinions of like older Uzbeks were about the Soviet Union. Like universally, everyone was like, yeah, there were problems and stuff. But then they would start contrasting just like basic respect for workers and like how you could very easily as like a, normal worker, like take a vacation in Latvia or the Baltic states or something. And like this was all subsidized. Like there is a mean, yeah, there were obviously problems, but like there is a stark difference in just like basic quality of life. In Uzbekistan, at least. I've not been to Georgia, but that seems to be, I've been to a couple other post-Soviet states, and that seems to be like a common sentiment amongst the older generation. It's like, I think there was amongst a certain sector, there was this like sort of like maybe naivete that like westernizing and engaging in these pro-market reforms would yield these like bountiful benefits. But I think now a lot of people definitely have that regret. I've had a similar experience in other post-Soviet places.
I wanted to ask and clarify a bit more because I'm confused whether what you're just... So I'm having a hard time trying to center these two opposing views. On the one hand, we had experiences under the Soviet Union, and then we had shock therapy break that all up and create all these different individualistic kind of no longer
30 years of shock therapy.
Exactly. And it seems like despite 30 years of shock therapy, there still persists of not having to shop all the time, for example. That might be due to not having the consumption power comparative to the West, and the consumer goods are not that prevalent on the market, which makes it impossible to do so. But is it the case that there's still a desire to do so? Or is it because... So I'm kind of confused here. I have two opposing views.
Yeah. Good question. So are you finished with the question, or do you want to?
There's a stark contrast between the Soviet experience and current post shock therapy or ongoing shock therapy experience, and there's some overlap. I guess I'm curious about how those things are distinguishable. And then there's also talk about constant poverty, all these economic hardships. And then there's also people being quite free-going, quite chill. And you talked about this earlier, about the organizing experiences, the left compared to the US and in Georgia, that in the US they were actually more disciplined. And when we think about post-Soviet neoliberal hellscape, I have trouble kind of putting those two things together. How can you be a neoliberal hellscape and still be more chill about it? Like, what's happening there?
Yeah, because most people are unemployed.
What is the unemployment rate in Georgia?
So the discipline, I would say like it says like I think 11 or 12%, but it's actually sick. Like people, there was like what's it called when they like ask people?
Survey kind of thing. Yeah.
And the city had 60% is what said that I feel unemployed.
60?
I think that's, yeah.
So like maybe they have some informal side hustles, but they're not really in like sustained formal employment.
It's like everybody's sort of, what's the word? Precarious here. So you can maybe get some money here for like 2 months and then be unemployed. You know, it's just like a constant, it's sort of just like, you know, poor neighborhoods in the US. Right. It's like inconsistent workforce, not inconsistent work opportunities, and like they're like there's a McDonald's job, go work at McDonald's, but it pays like so little that you can survive on it. So like most of the, like let's say a lot of people are making around $100 a month. And they don't really have a lot of money, like as far as purchasing power. That's what I was saying. Some of the things, like conspicuous consumption is very much alive in Georgia. It's just now relegated to a certain class, right? There's sort of new wealthy professional types who are all about conspicuous consumption. And so having this material stuff is like very important for them. And try to distinguish, you know, the upper class stuff, they try to distinguish themselves from the poor by consuming different things, right? So they're not like just going and buying at one store, and then the rich have to start buying at another store all the time. It's like kind of ridiculous, but to see it so up close, because it's such a small place, you see things more.